Hello, good evening. I'm Theresa Zammit Lupi. I'm a book and paper conservator. I work at the Notarial Archives, and right now I'm working on the rehabilitation project of the archives. But I'm here today because I've been kindly asked by the Central Bank to talk to you about the Lil-Adam manuscripts. So, manuscripts which happen to be a very favorite subject for me, and in particular these manuscripts which are marvelous and massive. So off we go with the lecture. So I'm really delighted that the central bank has decided to issue these coins with one of the initials from the Lil-Adam choir books. They are very beautifully minted and quite perfectly copied. Talking of coins, I always wondered how many scudi were paid to have 10 choir books commissioned in 1533. No account books or financial documents have survived that show prices for this commission. But just think about this for a moment. These manuscripts are almost 1 meter high. Each contains about 100 parchment leaves, and they are all decorated with miniatures. As each folio is made from the skin of one animal, a huge number of calf skins were used, where a huge number of calves were required to produce them. It is quite extraordinary to think that the 10 volumes together would amount to over 1,000 individual skins, all of which require, of course, uniform preparation and, as well, an affluent patron to purchase them. The manufacture of such a collection almost certainly involved teamwork by several craftsmen, including scribes, decorators, illuminators, and bookbinders, as well as parchment, leather, and woodworkers. So it is without doubt that this was definitely an expensive commission. In this lecture, I will highlight three major topics rather. I will first give an introduction on the history of the collection. Then I'll talk about how the manuscripts were made, and I'll also make observations on related manuscripts. So, to start with the historical introduction on the Lil-Adam choir books, we're talking of 10 graduals. So there are 10 volumes, and until a couple of years ago, they were housed in the Museum of St. John's Co-Cathedral in Valletta, and they are now temporarily in storage until refurbishment works are finished within the museum complex. They are dated 1533. They were commissioned by Grandmaster Lil-Adam, from where we get the name Lil-Adam Graduals, and the Grandmaster was he was Grandmaster of the Order of the Knights of St. John when the order settled in Malta in 1530. They were produced in France primarily by the collaborators of the illuminator Jean Pichot. They are called graduals because the term is derived from the Latin word gradus, which means step, because the music was sung from the steps of an altar or pulpit. A gradual contains the music that accompanies the sung Roman Catholic Mass. They are often incorrectly called antiphonals, which are also large choir books. But antiphonals contain the music of the sung divine office, not of the Mass. So graduals contain the music of the Mass. These 10 volumes contain the complete liturgical cycle for special feast days, starting with the first Sunday of Advent and end with the feast of St. Andrew at the end of November. All the music is in Gregorian chant and is unaccompanied. So it's just music to be sung, not for playing. And it's also known as plain chant, so you have just one voice. For those who are unfamiliar with Valletta, and here I'm referring to some friends of mine or other people who have logged in to listen to this lecture from abroad, who have never perhaps been to Malta or are not familiar with St. John's Cathedral. This is the interior of the church, which was consecrated in 1578. And it was really quite something. It is really a jewel of a church. It is richly decorated with carvings, paintings, and sculpture. And it is also where our 2 Caravaggio paintings are housed. And these are the choir stalls behind the altar, from where the manuscripts were sung from. This collection, as I said, was commissioned by Grand Master Lilla-Dame, which you see here in this portrait. His coat of arms appears on most of the full miniature folios in this collection. Apart from his coat of arms, one also finds the motto of the Knights of St. John on many of the folios. And the motto reads, "Pour la foi," meaning for the faith, precisely because the order of the Knights of St. John was a religious and military order, apart from being a hospitaller order. So they were militant for the faith, to save the faith, to guard the faith. The manuscripts date to 1533, and as you can see here, the date is found on one of the miniatures. It also includes the motto in 3 languages, so there it goes again, "Pour la foi, pro fide, and voor den gelobe," in French, Latin, and Flemish. The manuscripts are bound in leather over wooden boards. The boards, which are mostly made of oak, are skillfully constructed with vertical rails and horizontal panels, so as to prevent warping. Wooden dowels are also used instead of metal pins. Each volume weighs about 30 kilos. So handling them during research meant having to ask someone to help me each time I wanted to have a look at the cover. It really is cumbersome to work with such massive volumes. I started studying these manuscripts in 2004, and each time I look at them, I never fail to be impressed at their beauty. I recently carried out a study on the flowers and fruits that are painted in these miniatures, which are mostly found in the borders and initials. There are at least 15 types of flowers, with the rose being the most common. They have fine brushwork, the use of color is delicate, and the application of pigment and gold is of superior quality. The graduals contain miniatures that are both stylistically rendered as well as botanically accurate. Here you see 2 flowers, one that is simple and stylized, and the roses on the right that are realistically rendered. And these are some of the fruits that are found in the borders and initials: pears, grapes, red currants, cherries, and strawberries, most of which are berries that would grow in northern climates in the 16th century. There are also many fantastic beasts, griffins and dragons, several of which are found intertwined or forming mirror images of each other. Some appear like sea monsters or as mythological creatures, half human and half beast. The display of birds, insects and butterflies are also included in the decorations and are used as fillers amongst foliage and floral motifs. Although there is uniformity throughout the manuscripts, there is also diversity, suggesting the intervention of different hands. For example, here are 4 different representations of the Virgin Mary. From left to right, in the Nativity and Visitation scenes, she is more youthful, with her hair tied back, or with long wavy hair, almost resembling Botticelli's Venus. While in the scenes of the Presentation and Pentecost, the Virgin appears to be older and her head is veiled. The depiction of Christ is also found in 4 distinct ways. He always wears a grey tunic, except after his death, when he is wearing a red cape over his tunic, as the resurrected Christ. There are a number of variations with regards to his facial features. Sometimes he has a double-pointed beard or rounded lips, sometimes shorter hair or pronounced pink cheeks. Christ is also represented with blue eyes on the far right, which is, in the history of art, is considered to be quite unusual. I'll be discussing these miniatures later on in the talk. So I move on to some historical facts about the graduals. And this is a little bit like book archaeology, so to speak, because there are layers of history. So, allegedly, the Lillevam graduals were known as the manuscripts that were brought by the order of the Knights of St. John from Rhodes. However, the date 1533 confirms otherwise, because the order was in Malta already by 1530. After the Council of Trent, there were changes in the liturgy, so folios were pulled out, music and text were scraped or rubbed off, and new parchment folios inserted in 1582. So this only happened 50 years after the manuscripts were produced. In the 18th century, more interventions were carried out on 4 volumes, which were completely covered in paper with new text and music. In the 1950s, Don Mauro Induanes, then the librarian of the National Library of Malta, restored 3 volumes. So the first intervention that was carried out on these manuscripts was in 1582, after the revised publication of the Roman Missal. This is the index folio of one of the manuscripts, which was inserted after the Council of Trent. At the bottom right, there is the insertion of a declaration that states that Tridentine reforms were carried out in 1582. In English, this would read, "Each and every rubrication in this book, which is not in this table of contents, is considered null and void, and we approve the controlled table of contents in accordance with the Roman Missal, edited by the Holy Council of Trent in 1582 of the Gregorian corrected calendar." And as declared in the first folio of each manuscript, changes were done to the text and notation in line with the new liturgy of the Mass. So on the right you can see how pieces of paper were glued onto the staff lines to cover up the old music, and in some cases the notation was erased. To the left you can see entire runs of text that were deleted. What's even more intriguing is that in some cases entire folios were cut and sold to bookbinders who turned these folios into parchment covers. This is one example from the notarial archives, of which there are over 100 examples of recycled covers. The newly inserted parts of the mass after the Council of Trent also included a new set of decorations, this time in a totally different style to the French miniatures. These are Italian and were probably carried out by a Dominican friar who was also responsible for decorating the choir box for the cathedral in Mdina. Yet another intervention was carried out on these manuscripts in the 18th century, when 4 out of 10 graduals were covered in paper with new text and music that has nothing to do with the 16th century music beneath. The new chants included antiphons to the archangels Gabriel and Raphael, and here you see how a curious individual had tried to peel away the paper to reveal the decorations beneath. So how was this done? Well, 4 pieces of paper were glued to each parchment folio by being overlapped in the center, and were glued on either side of every folio, and new text and music written upon them. And here you see how in some cases, even more than 1 layer of paper was stuck onto every parchment folio, creating tremendous bulk to the manuscript. This slide shows 2 fully decorated folios which were covered up. And these images were taken by using transmitted light so that all the decorations are visible, but sadly these are covered in paper, so unfortunately we are unable to see them. One of the major problems is that the moisture that was used to glue the paper to the parchment has led to severe undulations and cockling that in turn have led to distortion and loss. Another more serious problem is that the ink used in the 18th century has been corroding for a long time. There is loss in both the paper and the parchment substrate, and in some cases the illuminations below can be seen through the corroded text. Fascinating to look at, but a nightmare for a conservator. Since the papers were added on both sides of each folio, there has been a 300% increase in the thickness of the volume. So now the joints are breaking and the fastenings are unable to reach each other. The last intervention that was carried out to the graduals was in the 1950s, when Don Mauro Iguanes, then the librarian of the National Library of Malta, restored 3 of the 4 volumes that were covered in paper. Sadly, entire folios were cropped, altering the size of the volumes, and in some cases the text and notation were outlined in black marker pen. Illuminations became smudged from the chemicals that were used, and much of the fine quality of the 16th century manuscripts was lost from extensive restoration work. We move on to the second part of this lecture, which is the way the manuscripts were made. Well, turning an animal's skin into a surface for writing is a painstaking job. In a nutshell, it involves soaking the skins in a lime solution to soften the hairs, scraping the skin from the hair side with a knife, stretching it and allowing it to dry, and scraping it a second time until a desired thickness is reached, which is known as defleshing. Parchment has both a hair side and a flesh side. As you can see here, the flesh side is whiter and greasy, and the hair side is yellower and velvety. What's interesting are the details of the hair follicles. Under magnification, you could clearly see the colors of the hairs of the animal. As I mentioned before, one skin was used for every folio. Here you can see the spine of the calf running across the folio. The spine region is always where there is a concentration of more hair follicles, making the skin look darker. This slide shows scraping marks caused during the dehairing and defleshing phases that were left by the Lunello knife, a crescent-shaped knife. And if the parchment maker applied too much force, there was the risk of tearing through the wet skin. In fact, you can see here some flay holes, what are known as flay holes, which are small cuts made in the skin that occur during scraping. These holes were often stitched up while the skin was still damp to prevent further damage. Flay holes could also have been caused by a disease in the animal or an insect bite that would leave a scar on the skin. Once the skins were ready for use, the first thing that had to be done was to organize the page layout. This was quite a task because the scribe had to consider where to position the text, notation, and decoration. And even if an exemplar was available for copying, the size of each manuscript was never exactly the same, so this meant arranging the manuscript to scale in proportion to the size available. Here you can see what are known as bounding lines, which create the margins, the main margins of the folio. To create margins and lines for writing and staff lines for notation, prick marks were done on the edges of the folios that were then joined uniformly from side to side. This prevented ruling from being distorted and from skins going to waste. From a study on the marks that were used for pricking, I could determine that at least 5 different tools were used within the same manuscript. What is even more meaningful is that this suggests that more than one scribe was working on the same manuscript at the same time, with each one having a favorite tool for pricking and ruling. And of course, this suggests a scriptorium that was quite large. This slide shows that staff lines were carried out with what is known as a rostrum or rake. Essentially, a rake made of 4 pens is attached to a rod. The pens are dipped in ink and used together to speed up ruling. We know that rake ruling was used here because the parallel staff lines quiver in unison, probably through an object that got caught under the folio, causing the rake to move during ruling. Once the page is laid out, the next step is writing the music and the text. The black ink used in the Lilla manuscripts is iron gall ink. This is prepared by mixing gall nuts with ferrous sulfate and gum arabic. This would initially be black, but over time it becomes brown. In order for the ink to be able to dry quickly, dry sand was sprinkled over the freshly written text. In some cases, the so-called drying sand is still attached to the parchment or paper substrate. In the case of the choir books here, sand is found on the 18th century paper that was used to cover up the 16th century text. This would normally be brushed off, but in this case, the gum arabic used as a binding agent in the ink was still too tacky, so the sand remained attached to it till this very day. The decoration is perhaps the most time-consuming in the production of any manuscript. The Lilla graduals are laid out in a typical hierarchical fashion, what is known as the hierarchy of decoration. This means that the opening of every important Mass, such as Pentecost Sunday, which you see here, starts with a fully decorated folio, which also includes a historiated initial. A historiated initial includes a biblical scene or a scene related to a specific feast. In this case, we see the historiated initial S for Spiritus Domini. Decorations often acted as a visual aid to pick up musical sections within the text, which choristers often already knew from memory. Much of the decoration was, of course, also done to embellish the books. There are a total of 1,600 decorations in the 10 graduals. And I repeat this just in case you didn't understand me correctly. 1,600 decorations in just 10 books. The sections within the mass are introduced via two types of initials, those that are illuminated with gold and those which have a mixture of gold leaf and shell gold. So what you see on the left is an initial with gold leaf alone, and on the right an initial with gold leaf and shell gold. And the shell gold is seen beneath as a background gold beneath the pansies, and it is a matte gold as opposed to the gold leaf, which is burnished and shiny. Colored penwork initials that are composed of grotesque portraits known as cadelles also form part of the decorative scheme. These cadelles are really quite beautiful and also quite cheeky in a way, often found with frowning faces, glaring eyes and crooked noses. The smallest of all the decorations are those that embellish the verses within a kyrie. They alternate in red and blue pigment and are decorated with white highlights. And so this was the hierarchy of decoration. There are basically four main decorated initials, so to speak. The historiated, then you have the ones in gold and gold leaf and shell gold, which start at the beginning of sections within the mask. Then the ones with cadelles with grotesque faces, and then finally the small ones. And I move on now to the page numbering system of these graduals. So how were folio numbers written? Well, you can see here from this slide that they were written in Roman numerals. The Arabic numerals are written in black there. Those were inserted at a much later stage. But in 1533, when these manuscripts were produced, the numbering was written in Roman numerals. And as you can see here, you have to the left number 3, 111, and to the right you have 33, XXX 111. I put these two just as general examples of how Latin Roman numerals are written. So the paging of the manuscripts, the pagination of the manuscripts was pretty straightforward until you get to folio 79, where okay, so you have folio 70, LXX, L being 50, XX being 10 and 10, so that's 70, and then LXX1, so that's 71, and so forth. When it comes to folio 80, you would expect LXXX, right? So you have L50, XXX, 10, 10, 10, which gives you 80. But in this case, what happens is that when you get to folio 80, it is written in this way. It is written as 80 in French. So you have literally 4 times 20. And so you have 80 for 80, and 81 and 82, and so forth. So it's really, I mean, what does this all mean? Well, this is an extremely meaningful discovery, so to speak. Well, it is clear that the scribe who wrote these page numbers was French or French-speaking. If you were Italian or, say, Spanish, you would have used 80 or 80 and written LXXX. So this, in a way, was a great giveaway to the provenance of the manuscripts. And I now move on to the third section of this lecture, which is about the observations on related manuscripts. Given the different styles in the 10 manuscripts, there's no doubt that there were several hands involved suggesting a team of collaborators. It is not possible to ascribe the manuscripts to one particular artist. 4 main styles emerge from my study, 3 of which are associated with the French illuminator Jean Pichot, the 4th is Italianate, and one of the Pichot styles is also associated with the master of Claude de France. By way of comparison, here are a couple of examples that show parallels with Jean Pichot's known works and the L'Isle-Adam manuscripts. This is a detail of a border from a Jean Pichot manuscript at the Bibliothèque Mazarin in Paris. To the left are 2 borders from the L'Isle-Adam manuscripts, which both display sharp outlines and a candelabrum arrangement, which is very typical of the Renaissance. And these can be very much, can be compared very closely to Jean Pichot's manuscript on the right. The same kind of scroll work, the same painted gold and gold on blue background, which is also a dotted background in a very similar manner. And this slide here shows the work of the master of Claude de France in a manuscript at the Morgan Library in New York. There is much of the same delicate brushwork, particularly in the facial complexions, and the type of gold highlights worked with accuracy on a small scale may also be compared. Now, one quick note about Jean Pichot. He was active in Paris and had a large commercial enterprise producing both sacred and secular texts. He was involved in book printing in Paris. Strong Renaissance influences are seen in his work, such as the use of classical elements. There's difficulty to identify his style because of the large atelier. So he had so different hands working in his name, so it makes it difficult to identify his works. He is associated with Rouen in connection with Cardinal Georges d'Amboise, who was one of his earlier patrons. And now this is perhaps the most important bit that connects Malta here to Jean Pichot, where Georges d'Amboise was the brother of Grandmaster Emery d'Amboise, who became Grandmaster in 1503 till 1512, when the order was still at Rhodes. At the time, L'Isle-Adam was Captain General of the galleys and was probably trying to work his way up to become Grand Master. The two would have certainly known each other, both being French. It is not surprising, therefore, that L'Isle-Adam commissioned his manuscripts from an atelier connected with Rouen, obviously at a later stage when he became Grand Master. What is important to note is that Jean Pichot had died by the time Grandmaster L'Isle-Adam had commissioned his manuscripts. So the style in our manuscripts is definitely of Pichot's collaborators and not his very own. Among many of the works Jean Pichot was responsible for were 6 choir books which were produced in 1520, of which 2 are now lost. The remaining 4 are in Berlin, Baltimore, California, and Massachusetts. All 4 manuscripts are extremely similar in quality, size, technique, and refinement. Of course, these were a set of graduals meant to be very similar to each other as a complete set. I have been able to see the ones at the Staatsbibliothek in Berlin and the one at Harvard University in person. So I've been able to look at them in detail. The California and Baltimore manuscripts I have studied through digital images. And here are some remarkable comparisons, particularly with the Harvard choir book. The figures of Christ in a pointed beard, wearing a grey tunic with gold highlights, and the similarity in the depiction of the fruits and flowers and the overall color schemes reflect an influence between the Harvard choir book and the Maltese collection. And here again, in this slide, the colors are extremely similar. You can see the same palettes are being used, the same kinds of reds and blues. The rendition of the Virgin's dress and her lacy collar and wispy hair, the gold highlights on the drapery folds, and the soft facial features are strikingly similar. Also the rendering of the book and the footwear on the right. And again, here we see parallels in the way the angel is appearing to the shepherds in the distant background. The checkered green and red floor tiles, the classical elements in architectural features, and the fascinating Renaissance fashion in the headdresses. There is no doubt that whoever was working on the L'Isle-Adam graduals had been familiar with Pichot's manuscript. Now, in our recent discovery at the Notarial Archives, I came across something that has to be shared with you here. This is a recycled cover for a volume containing notarial deeds. This music manuscript may not appear to be as attractive as the L'Isle-Adam manuscripts, but you have to keep in mind that this is an unfinished piece. From the text and music, by studying the text and music, which include alternating psalms and antiphons, one can almost certainly deduce that this is a fragment that was intended to form part of an antiphonal. The most exciting part of this recycled cover was found in the turn-in fold of the front cover, which shows L'Isle-Adam's coat of arms. And as you can see here, the decoration of the arms in between two rampant dragons is very similar to the one in the graduals, suggesting that the same scriptorium was working also on this manuscript. And why is this important? Well, this fragment confirms that Grandmaster L'Isle-Adam had commissioned more than just the surviving graduals we have at St. John's Co-Cathedral. From other remaining similar fragments in different collections in Malta, I had always suspected that L'Isle-Adam may have commissioned other liturgical manuscripts, but there was no evidence other than stylistic grounds to confirm my hypothesis. Finally, this finding of the coat of arms on this fragment has provided the necessary evidence. In trying to develop a picture of what truly existed in 16th century Malta, one is bound to consider also the remnants of what was destroyed completely. Returning to the graduals, as a book and paper conservator, I cannot but mention their condition and the need for their conservation treatment, which of course was one of the reasons why I studied them. This slide shows Rodent Attack. Mice and rats love paper and parchment makes a delicious protein meal for them. The entire corner of one of the choir books has been eaten away by rodents. During the Second World War and a few years after, the choir books were stored in a room adjacent to the cathedral, now part of the offices. And I know this from having interviewed an old Monsignore who remembers this. The roof had caved in during the war, and the manuscripts had been exposed to the elements. Thankfully, the thick wooden boards saved many of the folios. The manuscripts present mold damage and staining. The mold is inactive, but the parchment has weakened and would require reinforcement in areas that are fragile. Silverfish damage is seen on the red letters, on the rubricated letters. It is curious how the insect seems to be attracted to the red pigment, but not the black ink. And this is probably, it is probably attracted to a protein in the binding agent, probably a gelatin, which was used to prepare the vermilion, the red pigment. One of the major problems with these graduals is pigment flaking and lifting. These manuscripts were used for centuries. Turning the large folios meant that parts of the parchment would crease, causing the color to crack and split. The consolidation of the pigments is therefore absolutely crucial. But as you may have noticed by now, the biggest problem is the ink corrosion in one of the volumes, which is still covered in paper. Tests for the removal of this paper to reveal the 16th century miniatures have been carried out and were successful. This treatment could also be done without damaging the 18th century paper, so both the 16th century substrate and the 18th century paper would be saved without damaging either of them. Perhaps I'm biased about the Lille-Adam manuscripts, but I don't think it's the case. These graduals are to manuscripts what Caravaggio is to painting. I cannot stress further how significant they are in the history of French illuminated manuscripts. Our knowledge on their value and preservation is therefore not to be overlooked. I have concluded my doctoral research on these manuscripts 12 years ago. It is hoped that funds would be sought to save this collection sooner rather than later. And talking of money, I return to the coins produced by the central bank. The letter O stands for omnis and is the opening for the Mass of the second Sunday after the Epiphany. On this Sunday, the newly born Christ has just been worshipped with gifts when the three kings visit him at Bethlehem. This opening piece is taken from Psalm 65, which reads, Omnis terra adoret te Deus, meaning, let all the earth adore you, O God. In this period of social distancing, confinement, and uncertainty, it might be appropriate to reflect on this psalm, for adoring God has become so unfashionable. Instead, by allowing the beauty of sacred art and music to reach our depths, we might also be able to contemplate this change in our lives, which gives us hope in wanting evermore to preserve it. Thank you very much for listening.
Gosh, Theresa, I'm sure that the dozens of people who were watching us will have as many questions as I do. And we've managed to get a few down, which I hope we'll have time for. First of all, thank you so much for being with us, especially in these very difficult social distancing time. And I'd like to, on behalf of the bank, please apologise on behalf of Kevin Kassar, our excellent curator at the Coin Museum, who would have loved to have been here in person, and the Governor, Mark Ravello, who, as well as I'm sure a lot of our staff, would have also loved to be here, but are following from home. Just to remind everyone, the reason that we're here is because the Malta Coin Centre, which is the minting arm, the numismatic arm of the Central Bank of Malta, issues several coins every year. And the Lille-Adam graduals were the first ones. These are the coins here. You can see them in their real size. They've been a tremendous hit, and I can understand why. The detail in them makes them, I think, one of the most beautiful coins, what sets of coins we've ever issued here at the Central Bank. These are, the first batch were completely sold out, I'm very happy to say, but they are still available from the Malta Coin Centre. The counter at the bank was closed because of COVID, but gradually things have started to open up, and it's now open from 8:30 to 12:30 every weekday morning. For those of you who'd like to come, you can also order them online. So that's the salesman part. Let's get back now a little bit to your lecture. And as I said, I was absolutely fascinated. And the first question that we had was about the fact that these were still drawn by hand. You mentioned the scriptorium, but perhaps you can give us some indication. Do we have any idea where the scriptorium is? And how many monks would have been involved in actually, in a scriptorium?
Okay, first of all, Jean Pichot had a secular scriptorium, so these were not necessarily monks, but lay people.
Oh, okay.
So because there's this image of a scriptorium connected with a religious order. But in this case, it wouldn't have been like that. It would have been an active scriptorium. Jean Pichot had two workshops, one in Paris and one in Rouen. So he was doing and throwing. He was also a printer, so he's producing books. We're talking about the first 2 decades of the 1500s, so 1500 to 1520. So printing was really in by then. It had been already established for a good 50 years. So it was this new art, and Pichot was very involved in printing as well. He was a very enterprising individual. So you get large, a big scriptorium or big workshop, so to speak.
We have no idea where ours came from, Rouen or from Paris.
No, we can't really, unless we have documentary evidence saying that this has come, from this particular place. You cannot identify.
You mentioned the printing side of it. In fact, that's another of the questions that I have here. You mentioned that there'd been printing around for several years. Decades. The Gutenberg Bible had been printed in 1450. So why would something like this still have been done so meticulously by hand rather than printed?
Well, one of the major reasons is the actual size. To be able to produce paper which was thick enough and sturdy, which was possible to be printed in those dimensions, would be extremely difficult, and it wouldn't survive. So they opted for parchment because parchment is sturdy, and so of course you have to write on parchment, which is the reason why choir books kept being produced even up to the 18th century, whereas all other kinds of books were printed by then. So yeah, this is the main reason.
And of course they were used. I mean, it wasn't a case of something that you only referred to every now and then. They would have actually been used.
Yes, on special feast days. Yes, on special feast days. So last Sunday was Pentecost. They would have been used. So the Ascension, Christmas, Easter, the Epiphany, and many other feast days. So not every Sunday, but many Sundays.
For those of you that joined us late, we actually opened this lecture with a section of Gregorian chant, which was from Omnis Terra, which is the actual O came from omnis, and we actually managed to find the chant for this particular piece of music, which I think is absolutely fascinating. We had another question here. Somebody said that you mentioned 1,600 decorations, and what they wanted to know was the artists. I mean, what would influence them? But in fact, you actually said that there were a lot of similarities between.
Many similarities and also many differences. So if you put all these 1,600 illuminations together, you can really group them into types and styles, which is why I
identify this person. One would have done this. Even if you look at the different beards, for example, that you pointed out, it's quite different.
Definitely, the different kinds of fruits, the different kind of foliage. After spending several hours looking at these and also looking at them on a screen on the computer, I spent several hours in the cathedral looking at the originals. But then when I would go home, I'd zoom in and look at these images. So you become very familiar at spotting the differences between one kind of initial and another, different kinds of features which you see in the figures and the brush strokes and the brushwork and the colors and the palettes. So yes, there are ways of identifying.
You've obviously done a lot of research on other, groups of books and so on, similar books and so on. How do ours rate? Are they top of the range?
Oh, they're absolutely fantastic, and this is one of the reasons why I even published the book, to try and promote these manuscripts as much as possible. And I've said this also in the lecture, how I believe very strongly that these manuscripts are the books with Caravaggioistic painting. So I really wish that people become very aware of how precious this collection is that we have here. And I really wish that one day, funds would be given for their preservation and their conservation. I really do feel they are extremely important.
I can't even imagine what you did. You showed a photograph of where the rats had actually eaten away at the parchment, and places where the ink had actually sort of burned through the paper and so on. Explain to me, how on earth do you restore that or conserve it? And there's a difference between restoration and conservation, I believe.
Yes, I don't use the word restoration, actually, I use the word conservation, because there is a difference in as much as how much one should intervene. So restoration is more interventive, conservation is more of a minimalist approach. One has to respect the historicity of the object and what it has been through. So, as I said, this is an archaeological site, so one has to be very careful not to remove too many traces of its past and of its history. So, for example, the interventions which were carried out by Domaro and Wallace in the 50s have their own meaning as much as, he was doing them in bona fide and in all, in the best of his ability. But one wouldn't remove them because they are important for the history
They're
of the
actually part
object.
of the footprint, yes.
And as for the rest of, the damage you mentioned, the corroded ink and rodent attack and all the rest. Well, I've done all the tests, for example, to be able to detach the paper from the parchment substrate, and I've done all the testing to ensure that no pigment would be soluble, and so you can use special techniques and solvents to prevent damage from occurring. So.
We're obviously very grateful as well to St. John's, where these choir books are normally on display. They're not on display at the moment.
No, because the cathedral is refurbishing, and so they are currently in storage. But hopefully when the museum opens, some of them should be on display again. So whoever would want to see them could see them there. Unless, of course, you buy my book.
Great. Well, it doesn't look like we've got any other questions. Or maybe just one. Thank you very much to our wonderful IT team. So, another question, if you don't mind. Why do you think the manuscript was painted in Gothic style, even though these were done in the Renaissance period? And is it possible that Knights of Malta did not embrace the rebirth from the Middle Ages, or was it just the artist's choice?
That's a very good question, because when I saw your coin, instinctively I said, goodness, is this what they chose out of all the initials? Well, actually, this O, amongst many other initials of this style, are very Gothic, and they're used in the 1300s, 1400s, 1500s, and early 16th century. So this is really a very favorite style that kept being used and used and used. But having looked at the whole collection of illuminations in the manuscripts, they are definitely Renaissance manuscripts. So I wouldn't call them Gothic manuscripts. So with exceptions, you would get a Gothic initial like this one. But as a general style, they are definitely Renaissance manuscripts. And in fact, I mentioned this throughout in the, in the decoration and the kind of even dress wear. It's very Renaissance, the candelabra, the classical features in the architecture, this, really a real rebirth of classicism, which you get in the Renaissance. So,
Theresa, your passion for the subject comes through so well. It's been absolutely fascinating listening to you. I've learned so much about all of these things, and that really does come out of your passion. Thank you so much for being with us, and thank you all for joining us for this, our very first ever virtual lecture, hopefully to be followed by many, many more. On behalf of the Central Bank, I wish you all a good evening.